The letter arrives on a Thursday morning, and by noon, a title that has existed for 65 years is gone. Buckingham Palace releases a short statement. No press conference. No warning shot fired in advance to the man it targets. Just a single sheet of paper that ends a lifetime of royal standing in the time it takes to read it. Andrew is no longer a prince. He is no longer a royal highness. As of that Thursday, he is simply Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a private citizen with a famous last name and nothing left to protect him. The king signs off on the decision himself. Buckingham Palace calls the move necessary censures. The word necessary is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because everyone reading it understands what it really means. The family ran out of other options. For years, the question inside royal circles was never if this would happen, it was when. Andrew's connection to the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein had followed him for over a decade, resurfacing again and again, each time a little louder than the last. But it's the release of a memoir by Epstein accuser Virginia Giuffre, published after her death, that finally tips the scale. Hi viewers, before we go further, if you found out today that a family member of yours had just lost their entire public identity overnight, would you speak up for them? Or would you stay quiet and let it happen? Drop your answer in the comments. Because staying quiet is exactly what the family had done for 15 years. And on this Thursday, quiet stops being an option. Royal commentators have pointed out that the timing is not random. Just weeks earlier, Andrew had already agreed to stop using his title voluntarily. It wasn't enough. Members of Parliament kept pushing. A formal debate on Andrew's conduct was becoming a real possibility, and a public parliamentary hearing was the one outcome the palace could not survive quietly. So Charles moves first. He strips his brother's titles by his own authority, before Parliament can do it for him. What almost nobody expects is what comes next. Because the titles are only the beginning. The house is next. Royal Lodge sits inside Windsor Great Park, 30 rooms of red brick and old money. And until this week, it belonged to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, in every way that mattered except paper. The eviction notice changes that. Formal notice is served. Surrender the lease. To understand why this detail matters more than the title itself, you have to go back to 2003, the year Andrew first signed the lease. He paid £1 million up front. He committed another £7.5 million to renovations. And in exchange, according to the leaked agreement obtained by The Times, his annual rent was set at 1 peppercorn if demanded. 1 peppercorn a year. That is not a metaphor. It is the literal legal term. And it means Andrew has lived in a £30 million estate for over 20 years, while paying, in practical terms, nothing. Royal commentators have called it one of the most unusual property arrangements connected to the monarchy in modern memory. A standard market rent on a property of that size would have run past £5 million across those 2 decades. Andrew paid none of it, because the contract didn't require him to.
There's a twist buried in the fine print, and it's the kind of detail that makes lawyers sit up straight. If Andrew is forced out before the lease's natural end in 2078, the Crown Estate may owe him compensation, reportedly as much as £558,000 plus an annual sum near £185,000 until 2028. Read that again. The man losing his home may still be owed money by the institution removing him from it. This is why the palace moves carefully. Even in disgrace, contracts don't bend just because reputations collapse. Andrew's lease was ironclad in a way his royal title never was. A title can be stripped by decree. A signed lease cannot be undone so easily, and that difference is about to matter more than anyone expected. Because behind closed doors, one figure in the family had already warned that this exact problem was coming. Princess Anne does not give interviews about her brother. She never has. In nearly 6 decades of public life, she has built a reputation on saying almost nothing and being trusted anyway. That reputation is why, When royal commentators discuss who inside the family carries the most quiet authority right now, her name comes up first. Anne's role in this story isn't loud, it's structural. She is the late Queen's daughter, the one working royal whose schedule of public engagements has outpaced nearly everyone else's for years running, and the one whose public image has stayed almost entirely untouched by scandal. That matters, because credibility is the one thing the monarchy cannot manufacture. It has to be earned, engagement by engagement, decade by decade. Anne has spent her life earning it. Andrew spent his spending it. Royal historians have long noted the contrast between the two siblings, both children of the same parents, raised under the same roof, and yet arriving at completely different places in the eyes of the public. One becomes a symbol of duty. The other becomes a legal liability discussed in Parliament. Under Charles's reign, working royals with clean records have become the institution's most valuable asset. Every engagement Anne completes without controversy is, in effect, a quiet argument for why the monarchy still deserves public support. Every headline about Andrew's lease, his titles, his finances, works against that argument. This is the part that royal commentators keep circling back to. The timing of Andrew's fall isn't just about protecting his reputation. It's about protecting everyone else's. As long as Andrew kept his lease, his titles, and his address inside Windsor Great Park, every one of Anne's engagements, every one of William's public appearances existed under the shadow of the same unresolved question hanging over the family. That shadow is what Charles is trying to remove, and it's why the next decision could not wait. 76 years old and undergoing treatment for cancer that the palace has never fully disclosed, Charles doesn't have the luxury of slow decisions anymore. Royal commentators have pointed to his health as one of the quiet forces behind the speed of this whole process. He is not building a monarchy for himself. He is clearing the ground for his son. That's the frame royal historians increasingly use to explain what happens next. This isn't really about punishing Andrew. It's about protecting William's inheritance before Charles is no longer the one making the decisions. On November 3, 2025, the king authorizes letters patent under the Great Seal of the realm. It's a formal legal instrument, the kind used to strip royal styles and titles, and it declares that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor shall no longer hold the style of Royal Highness or the titular dignity of Prince. The Lord Chancellor himself, David Lammy, is instructed by royal warrant to prepare the documents. This isn't guesswork or family pressure anymore. It's now written into the official record of the United Kingdom. Historians researching this moment point back over 100 years to 1917, when Prince Charles Edward, a grandson of Queen Victoria, lost the title Duke of Albany under the Titles Deprivation Act after fighting for Germany in the First World War. Until Andrew, that was the last time a British prince had a title formally removed. More than a century between one case and the next tells you exactly how rare and how serious this decision really is. Downing Street issues its own statement the following day, confirming the government's full support. That detail matters. It means this wasn't only a family decision. The British government was consulted in advance and gave its blessing before the announcement ever reached the public. Two institutions, the Crown and the government, now stand aligned against one man. And still, somehow, the story isn't finished. Because there's one more relationship inside the family that hasn't been accounted for yet, and it belongs to the woman who was married to Andrew for a decade. Sarah Ferguson married Andrew in 1986. They divorced in 1996. For nearly 30 years after that, she kept one thing the divorce never took from her: the title, Duchess of York. That ends too. When Andrew gives up his own titles, Ferguson reverts to using her maiden name. No formal legal battle, no public statement fighting the decision. Just a quiet erasure of a title she'd carried for almost 4 decades, longer than the marriage that gave it to her ever lasted. Royal commentators have pointed out how unusual this is. Ferguson wasn't accused of anything. She built her own public career, her own charity work, her own reputation, largely separate from Andrew's, and yet her title was never really hers to keep independent of his. It existed because of a marriage that ended in 1996, and it disappeared the moment his connection to the crown did too. That's the part of this story people miss when they focus only on Andrew. The fallout doesn't stop at the person being punished. It moves outward, to an ex-wife who has to give up a name the public has known her by for decades, to two daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, whose own weddings were once hosted at Royal Lodge, the same house their father is now being forced to leave. Meanwhile, the practical questions keep multiplying. Royal Lodge alone reportedly costs hundreds of thousands of pounds a year just to maintain. Sources close to the palace, speaking to reporters on condition of anonymity, have suggested Charles had already been quietly pressuring his brother to downsize before any of this became public. Concerned that Andrew was trying to maintain a lifestyle the family could no longer justify funding, publicly or privately. Andrew is expected to relocate to a property on the Sandringham estate, on land privately owned by the king rather than the crown estate, funded personally rather than by the taxpayer. The move itself hasn't fully happened as this story is being told, and that unfinished detail, a man packing up 30 rooms of history while the palace insists it will not comment further, is exactly where the next chapter of this family story picks up. The invitation to Sandringham never comes that December. Andrew stays behind at Royal Lodge instead, and for the first time in years, the absence says more than his presence ever could. By early 2025, court documents tied to a separate immigration case start working their way into public view, and they pull Andrew into a story far bigger than a lease or a title. The documents center on a businessman named Yang Tengbo, a man the UK Home Office had already barred from entering the country on national security grounds, based on advice from MI5, Britain's domestic security service. Yang wasn't a stranger to Andrew. He was a founding member of Pitch at Palace China, an offshoot of the prince's own business mentoring initiative, and according to reporting from The Telegraph, Andrew held a clause granting him a 2% cut of the venture's profits. That detail alone turns a diplomatic embarrassment into a financial one. Court papers reviewed by the Sunday Times go further, describing Andrew as having been viewed by Chinese officials as a valuable communication channel. Reporting also describes Yang helping draft letters from Andrew to China's president, discussing an initiative called the Eurasia Fund, a plan to expand Pitch at Palace into something closer to an investment vehicle. Once government warnings reach him, Andrew ends all contact with Yang. That part isn't disputed. What is disputed, and what royal commentators have spent months debating, is how much of this the royal household knew about while it was happening. A former aide's witness statement, filed as part of Yang's own legal appeal, offers one answer. According to that statement, the household, including the late queen herself, was aware of the communication channel with China. It wasn't hidden. It was, in the aide's own words, an arrangement that was certainly accepted, and may even have been encouraged. That single sentence changes the entire shape of the story. This isn't a case of one man acting alone, disconnected from the family that shares his name. It's a case of an arrangement the institution knew about, tolerated, and now has to answer for. And the questions being asked in the aftermath aren't really about Yang Tengbo anymore. They're about what else the family knew and how long they knew it before any of it reached the public. Suella Braverman, then Britain's Home Secretary, doesn't mince words when she addresses Parliament about the ban on Yang Tengbo. She tells lawmakers the decision was made because his presence posed a threat to our national security based directly on intelligence from MI5. That's not a phrase used lightly by a sitting government minister. National security threat is about as serious as language gets in a parliamentary chamber, and it's now permanently linked, on the public record, to a man who spent years inside Andrew's business circle. The former aide who gave evidence in the case, a man named Dominique Hampshire, adds another detail that royal commentators have picked apart since it surfaced. He says he met with both Andrew and King Charles multiple times over the 6 months before his statement, specifically to discuss what Andrew could do moving forward in a way that is acceptable to His Majesty. Those conversations, according to the statement, included discussion of independent funding options for Andrew's future outside official royal duties. In other words, while headlines focused on a spy scandal, the family was quietly negotiating something else entirely: how to fund a disgraced royal's life once every formal source of institutional support was gone. Buckingham Palace responds to the documents with a careful statement of its own, confirming that Charles had met with Andrew in Hampshire over the past year to discuss funding proposals, but insisting Yang Tengbo was never part of those conversations. Whether that distinction holds up is something royal biographers continue to debate. What isn't in dispute is the timeline. Hampshire's statement places the moment he first believed Andrew's reputation had become, in his words, irrecoverable, right after the 2019 BBC interview, years before any of this Yang Tengbo material became public. That means insiders inside the royal household had already concluded Andrew's royal future was finished, long before the rest of the country caught up. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the family already knew this outcome was coming years in advance, why did it take so long to act? The answer arrives later that year, and it comes in the form of a formal legal document. By October 2025, the answer nobody had been willing to say out loud finally becomes official. Buckingham Palace confirms Andrew will be stripped of every title he holds, and this time there is no ambiguity, no informal agreement to simply stop using a title voluntarily. This is permanent, and it is being done by direct order of the king. Royal expert Hilary Fordwich, speaking to reporters after the announcement, calls the timing a clear indication that Prince William is prevailing. That single line captures something royal commentators had been circling for months. This was never purely about Andrew's conduct. It was about who controls the direction of the monarchy going forward, and increasingly, that answer points to William. The government's response arrives fast. Downing Street issues a statement the next morning confirming it fully supports the decision, which tells you the palace didn't act alone. This was coordinated, cleared in advance, timed to avoid the appearance of a family panicking in public. Historians researching the legal side of the story keep landing on the same comparison. The last time a British prince lost a title through formal deprivation was 1917, when Prince Charles Edward lost the title Duke of Albany after fighting for Germany during the First World War under the Titles Deprivation Act. More than 100 years separate that case from this one. That gap alone tells you how rarely the monarchy is willing to use this kind of power against its own family. Andrew doesn't fight the decision publicly. He continues to deny the underlying allegations against him, but the titles are gone regardless, along with his memberships in the Order of the Garter and the Royal Victorian Order, both formally cancelled and erased from the official register weeks later. What's left is the house, Royal Lodge, the peppercorn lease, 30 rooms his daughters once celebrated their weddings in. The titles were removed by decree in a single afternoon. The house is proving far harder to let go of. Formal notice is served. Surrender the lease. For a man who spent 22 years paying almost nothing to live inside Windsor Great Park, those 4 words mark the real end of his royal life, more than any title ever could. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is expected to relocate to a property on the Sandringham estate, land privately owned by King Charles rather than the Crown estate, meaning the move will reportedly be funded personally by the king, not by British taxpayers. That distinction matters to royal commentators watching how the family manages public perception. Every pound spent from this point forward comes from Charles's private accounts, not the public purse, and that's very likely intentional. Sarah Ferguson's story closes quietly in the background. She reverts to her birth name, giving up the title Duchess of York, a title she'd held for nearly 40 years, decades longer than the marriage that originally gave it to her. No legal fight, no public statement contesting it, just a name that disappears from official use the same week her ex-husband's name changes too. What remains standing, largely untouched through all of it, is the structure around them. Anne continues her public schedule without interruption. William steps further into the role of the family's steadying presence, exactly as royal commentators had predicted he would once Andrew's chapter finally closed. This is the part that separates this story from an ordinary family scandal. Nothing about it was really about Andrew personally, not by the end. It was about proving the institution could survive its own worst chapter, hold the line on its own family, and come out the other side still standing. Whether that proof is enough to satisfy a public that's been watching this play out for over 15 years is a different question entirely, and it's the one the family still has to answer. 76 years old, undergoing treatment for cancer the palace has never fully described to the public, King Charles spends the final months of this story doing something few monarchs are ever forced to do in full public view, dismantling part of his own family on the record to protect the institution he'll eventually hand to his son. Royal historians studying his reign increasingly frame this decision as the defining act of his time as king, more consequential than any coronation ceremony or state visit. Not because of what it did to Andrew, but because of what it proved about the modern monarchy itself. Titles that once felt permanent turned out to be conditional. Loyalty to family turned out to have limits, once the family's conduct threatened the institution's survival. The last comparable case, in 1917, took place during a world war, when a prince's title was stripped for fighting alongside an enemy nation. This one took place during peacetime, over private conduct and financial arrangements that never should have survived public scrutiny in the first place. Royal commentators note that the comparison itself says something about how much scrutiny the monarchy now faces, even in years without a war to justify it. What comes next isn't fully written yet. Andrew's move to Sandringham hasn't finished playing out. Questions about who ultimately funds his life going forward remain open. And the deeper question, whether the institution can prevent a story like this from happening again under the next generation, rests almost entirely on William now, the same man royal experts say was prevailing the moment his uncle's titles disappeared. That's where this story stands today, and it's still moving. If you want to see how this plays out next, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this story as it develops. Drop a comment below with what part of this stood out to you most, and share this with someone who'd find it just as hard to look away from as you did.